it's always proof of the mundane claims, right? The things that, people in places, we know there were people in places. So if we find that there was a Nineveh, that doesn't mean that anyone spent a week inside a whale.
Hello, I'm Chris Mallard, the Daily Atheist, and you are watching The Atheist Edge. Stick around.
Eschatology is the field of theology which examines the final events of history. The end times have been and are being anxiously and joyfully awaited by a substantial percentage of Christians worldwide. The end of the world, to include the apocalypse, victory of good over evil, last judgment, rapture, believers called to heaven, and the second coming of Jesus has been unsuccessfully predicted countless times throughout history. Jewish rebel leader Simon Bar Giona predicted the Jewish Roman Wat of 70 CE would usher in the Messiah. French Bishop Martin of Tours believed the Antichrist had already been born and the end of the world would occur sometime around 400 CE. Martin Luther, founder of Protestantism, predicted the world would end before the year 1600 CE. Christopher Columbus wrote in his Book of Prophecies, 1501, that the final day would occur in 1656. Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, authors of the Left Behind apocalypse porn novels, predicted the global collapse, economic chaos, and the rise of the Antichrist on January 1st, 2000. Churches that I attended would discuss whether they were pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib. The Bible talks about a tribulation period of 7 years and is unclear as to where the rapture fits into it. Some Christians say that all Christians will be raptured before the tribulation. This is the pre-trib position. Some say in the middle, as it's described as being worse during the second half. The first half is the trumpet judgments and the second half is the bowl judgments. And some say that it comes at the end of the tribulation, just before Jesus returns. A common sermon joke is for the pastor to lay out all three views and some support for each and then declare, I am pan-trib. I know the tribulation is coming and it will all pan out in the end. Ha, ha, ha. Logic has videos of 14 failed rapture predictions in 3 months by one self-proclaimed prophet. Telltale has a video of Jehovah's Witnesses predicting the apocalypse in 2021. I personally have heard predictions that the Pope is the Antichrist. I've heard it for every Pope in my lifetime. That Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist because his name, Ronald Wilson Reagan, has 6 letters in each part, so 666, the mark of the Antichrist. I've also heard that Obama is the Antichrist. A friend asked if I thought political events of the past year and the pandemic were signs of the end times. No. Just no. And on Twitter, someone tried to tell me that microchips were the way the one world government was going to control the economy and receiving one would be the mark of the beast predicted in Revelation 13. He was surprised when I told him that I heard the exact same thing 40 years ago about plastic credit cards. Evidently, some card had reached the 666 series and Christians were going nuts about being issued a card with that number on it. One of the most famous predictors of the rapture is William Miller, originally a Baptist preacher. He originated the Millerism movement. He predicted the rapture to occur between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. When the latter day passed and nothing happened, he declared that he erred on the date, but the return of Christ was still imminent. One of his followers put the date on October 22nd, 1844, and Miller endorsed this prediction. Estimates of Millerite followers vary between 50,000 and 500,000. Following the October 22, 1844 date, called the Great Disappointment, tens of thousands either returned to their former churches or gave up Christianity altogether. Others began their own churches based on Miller's teachings. These have included the Seventh-day Adventists, Advent Christian Church, and the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Just going to leave this right here. I will destroy human wisdom and discard their most brilliant ideas. 1 Corinthians 1:19.
Hello, self-indictment.
I had something to say about that was incredibly brilliant, and it just escaped me.
Some of my best ideas do that all the time.
I just got that. Your idea has been smited.
Does it go back to the idea of faith is the most important thing, and that even if you have grand knowledge, like he's going to steal it from you because
That's my idea.
Forbidden knowledge? I don't know.
Well, knowledge and wisdom are two different things.
That's true. I understand that.
Yeah, and it goes back to Adam and Eve in Genesis, where you're punishing Eve for seeking knowledge. So it's blind faith in favor of actual
reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about the Old Testament prophecy. All right, let's get it started. According to the Old Testament prophecy, Jesus was supposed to be named Emmanuel. Oops, Jesus is not referred as Emmanuel anywhere in the New Testament. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory. Emmanuel is supposed to mean God with us. Where did Jesus come from? And why Jesus? Why don't we just consider him Emmanuel? I don't know. It makes no sense. I always wondered about this, but it's just never important enough to point out. But I guess do what you do, people. Christians, go for it.
The Quran was never fully compiled until after Muhammad's death. Everyone who claimed to have received a portion of the Quran directly from Muhammad was instructed to bring 2 witnesses with him to the mosque. Sitting at the entrance of the mosque was Zayd bin Thabit, the chief of the committee formed to compile the Quran. Zayd recorded each testimony in writing as each fragment was spoken to him. So when they were compiling the Quran, you had to show up with your fragment or your memorized portion. You had to bring 2 witnesses with you to verify. The last
wasn't it 150 years between Muhammad's death and when this is put together? So is the first book the book of Lying Sakashet? I mean, there 150 years, dude. No witnesses. Perfect crime. Knock yourself out.
So in Exodus, Moses and it says 600,000 men. So we can extrapolate that maybe the estimate is 2 million people walking out of, bondage in Egypt from, say, Cairo to Jerusalem. That's about 250 miles. It should take no more than 5 or 6 days on foot instead of 40 years. So your take on that?
Well, they got lost, dude.
Is that your take on it?
Seriously,
I mean,
they got lost and didn't want to ask for directions. I mean, come on.
My take
They didn't have Google.
is different. My take is that it's a made-up story. It never happened. It never happened with 500 people or 2 million people.
We know it didn't happen.
The people living in modern-day Israel, modern-day Palestine, they needed an origin story. And this whole idea that, Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had a son named Jacob, and he became Israel, and he had these 12 sons, and then they went to Egypt, and it's a made-up story.
But why did they need to make up a slavery story in Egypt when they had an actual real slavery story in Babylon? Why couldn't they have kind of gone off that one?
Later. I mean, like anything. I mean, every one of these stories in the Old Testament, we can either try to find some kernel of a basis for it, or we could just say it's a made-up story. And probably, if you had a video camera in history, you would find instances of both. You would find that there was some kernel of truth. There was one family that left Egypt, and that got blown into this whole thing, and and it was a 40-day journey that got blown into 40 years. Some of these probably do have a kernel of history, and some of them are probably just made-up stories. And I don't know that we can know I know the archaeologists tell us there's no evidence of this Exodus. There's no evidence of this Egyptian slavery of Hebrews. So, given the lack of evidence for the claims in the Bible, and given the fact that we know that some of these stories are just made up, it's just as easy for me to say this was probably a made up story.
And it underscore this, right? As clearly as it can be stated, the archaeology absolutely repudiates the idea that the Exodus is described in the Bible happened. There is no archaeology that supports that. And if it had happened, there would be archaeology supporting it. So we can say conclusively the Exodus as described in the Bible is made up.
And probably the enslavement of Hebrews in Egypt as well.
Probably that.
There's no evidence. I mean, the way it's typically portrayed in the Bible story movies is that the enslaved Hebrews were building all this great architecture in Egypt. There's no evidence of that. These were skilled tradesmen. These weren't slaves.
The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein, who's a Jewish biblical archaeologist that went into this looking for confirmation of his beliefs and did not find them, and was honest enough to let the world know, hey, the Exodus didn't exist. And,
So
every other leading biblical archaeologist says the same thing.
One of the things that Owen and I have talked about a lot when we've presented to secular groups is this idea that where archaeology does confirm the Bible, all it's confirming is the mundane claims, right? Like if there was a town of Nazareth and the archaeologists say that there was, or even if the archaeologists say there was a great flood or there was a human Jesus, I'm just giving examples. Anytime historians or archaeologists provide quote unquote proof of the Bible, it's always proof of the mundane claims, right? The things that, people in places, we know there were people in places. So if we find that there was a Nineveh, that doesn't mean that anyone spent a week inside a whale. And so you're never going to find archaeological evidence of supernatural claims. You're only going to find archaeology evidence of historical context. And we know there was some historical context. So even if someone could prove that the mass enslavement of Hebrews in Egypt had happened and that the mass exodus had happened, that wouldn't be proof of any of the supernatural claims. That wouldn't be proof of the pillar of fire or the plagues on Egypt. It would just be proof that people lived at that time and crossed the desert. I think that one of the things you'll hear apologists do, though, is they'll bring in where we do have evidence that from, let's say, the time of Solomon on, we have, significant historical evidence that, there were Hebrew people living in Palestine and they did have these religious customs. Where we do have that kind of evidence, it never establishes the supernatural. It never establishes the magic or the miracle. It just establishes, what we would establish on any other continent, which is this is how people lived.
You'll hear people try to defend the truthfulness of the Acts of the Apostles by listing true things that historical landmarks or actual places or something that appear in the Acts of the Apostles, and that the writer had to have known or seen or had that firsthand knowledge in order to write the story or in order to make that reference. And it's a claim too far, I think. In fact, for sure, it's a claim too far to argue for the veracity of the Acts of the Apostles as a story being told about the first century Christian church purely because it identifies cities and communities and people that appear in other places or that were historically true. For the same reason that we can't say that the Harry Potter books are actual true stories simply because they name the
London
ministry, England or London or writing on trains or anything else. The works of Tom Clancy are all fiction, in spite of the fact that they talk about aircraft carriers and ships, and these names exist, and squadrons, and being in the Mediterranean Sea, and government structures, and so on and so forth. It can still be completely made up and have a basis, using real things. It doesn't mean it's not fiction.
The point you make about apologists is that we've seen them do, and I call this the bait and switch, right? Where they'll say, I can prove to you you know, the New Testament, and they'll give all this, you know, archaeological evidence about the first century, and then say, you know, ergo, Jesus was born of a virgin and rose from his grave after he was crucified. And that doesn't, you know, obviously that doesn't work. But the Christians who are inclined to believe the apologists, you know, someone like Lee Strobel, you know, scores a lot of points with that kind of argument, and the rest of us are sitting there saying you didn't prove that at all.
I think Jericho, for instance, is ascertainable. I mean, it was an actual city that we know of, and the walls did crumble. That does not that is not evidence for they used horns and shouting to bring the walls down. Even
Right.
if you found Jericho and the crumbled walls, it still doesn't get you any closer.
Right. Exactly.
Yep.
Did Chris Mallard stop his daily show?
You know what? I didn't realize that until yesterday. What did he actually say? He basically said, I'm out of the atheist community.
Really? All of it?
Let's see what he said, just to make sure. Hey guys, I've stepped away from the atheist community. Could I get you to stop adding this account to these type of atheist lists? And oh shit, so he's done. And then I went and looked at his channel, and he hasn't posted anything new in a while. So yeah, he I could see it coming though. He had his goals set too high, and I could see him. He got discouraged more than once regarding his growth, you know, versus what he thought he was going to be at, you know, but within a year. So you got to keep your goals reachable. And like me, I've been plateaued at 7,500 subs for over a year now, for about a year now. No, over a year. So we're at a plateau, and I'm going to have to come to terms with that. And that's cool. A 7,500 is better than nothing, but it doesn't look like any more growth is going to happen.
All right. Moving right along. No, don't start singing the Muppet movie song.